A journey through a medieval tavern. Life, stories, and secrets revealed. Hey there, fellow adventurers. Tonight, we're stepping into the rowdy, smoky, and sometimes downright sticky world of a medieval tavern. Picture yourself walking through the dark, rain-slicked streets of a small medieval town. The cobblestones squelch under your boots, and every step you take seems to bring you deeper into the heart of a bustling, noisy town. The wind howls, and the air is thick with the smell of wet earth, animals, and something distinctly earthy. You can barely see in front of you as the rain pelts your cloak, soaking it through, and you can feel your stomach growling louder than your thoughts. The day has been long, and you are tired. But wait, what's that sound? There it is, the unmistakable cacophony of laughter, shouting, clinking mugs, and the unmistakable hum of a crowd gathering in revelry. That's your cue. You've made it to the tavern. Now, this isn't just any tavern. Oh no, this is the kind of place where stories are made, where friendships and rivalries are forged in the same breath, and where a knight, a farmer, and a bard could all find themselves in the same drunken mess before the night is over. It's the beating heart of every medieval town, the tavern, where all walks of life come together under one crooked, smoke-stained roof. Before we step inside and fully immerse ourselves in the raucous chaos that awaits, I'd love for you to join me in this adventure if you're ready to dive deep into the medieval world. Hit that like button and share this video with fellow history lovers or anyone who enjoys a good tale. If you've ever wondered what it was like to live in such a vibrant, messy, and unpredictable world, drop a comment below and tell me, what's your drink of choice in a medieval tavern? Ale, mead, or something stronger? I'm curious to hear what you think would be the drink of champions. All right, now that you've settled in, let's push that iron door open. Creak! The sound echoes through the room, and you are met with a blast of warmth. But not the clean, cozy kind of warmth you'd expect. No, this is the warmth of 1,000 candles flickering erratically in the smoke-filled air. It hits your face like a heavy blanket, mingled with the scent of wet wool, sweat, and something you don't quite want to think about. The tavern smells like a blend of chaos and comfort, all rolled into one. You step inside, and immediately your senses are assaulted. The low ceiling forces even the tallest of men to duck, and the floor beneath your boots is nothing but dirt, though, to be fair. There's a thin layer of straw spread around in a half-hearted attempt to keep things clean. The air is thick with smoke, and you can barely see more than a few feet in front of you through the haze. There's a giant hearth in the corner, flames flickering as people crowd around it, desperate for warmth. As you make your way through the noisy crowd, you hear laughter, shouting, and the unmistakable sound of a bard strumming a lute somewhere in the corner, though. Let's be honest, the tune is far from perfect. You spot a seat near the hearth and make your way over, trying not to bump into anyone or spill your mug. The benches are wobbly, the tables scattered haphazardly across the floor, There's no elegance here, no quiet corners to hide in, only a sprawling mess of wooden tables, benches, barrels, and people. A one-eyed dog gnaws lazily on a bone under a table, while someone in the corner argues loudly about a stolen chicken. Another man, already half drunk, is trying to impress a woman by telling a wildly exaggerated story about a dragon he once fought, or maybe it was just a goat. This is it, the beating heart of medieval society. It's loud, it's messy, and it's undeniably alive. You settle onto a bench, careful not to touch what might be wet, and take in the scene around you. The air smells of ale, sweat, and mystery meat cooking somewhere nearby. There's no waiter here, no menu, just the bartender standing behind a makeshift bar made from a thick plank of wood resting across two barrels. You ask what's available, and without missing a beat, the tavern keeper gruffly answers, "Ale or nothing." You nod, and before you know it, a mug is thrust into your hands. The ale is warm, thick, and unfiltered, a far cry from anything you'd call refreshing. But somehow, it's exactly what you needed. As you sip your drink, you notice the chatter around you. It's not quiet here, not even close. In fact, it's loud, chaotic, and intoxicating in its own way. People are yelling about the price of pigs, telling tall tales, and laughing so loudly that it feels like the walls themselves are shaking. You glance to your left and spot a red-faced farmer, already halfway through his third mug, telling anyone who will listen about the time his cow gave birth sideways. He slaps you on the shoulder mid-sentence, as if you're an old friend. You awkwardly laugh and nod, unsure if you should be impressed or horrified. Across the room, there's a soldier holding court with a crowd of listeners. His tale involves a battle with Frenchmen, dragons, and a talking sword that seems a bit too fantastical to be true. But no one questions him. No one cares. They're all here for the story, not for the truth. In the corner, a bard strums his lute with all the enthusiasm of someone who forgot what notes were, while at least two women are trying to dodge the advances of a man with two remaining teeth who's making way too many clumsy compliments. Another fellow, clearly too far gone, has fallen asleep under a table, his mug still gripped tightly in his hand. And in this raucous mess, in this medieval version of a social media feed, you find yourself laughing, listening, and becoming part of the living, breathing chaos of it all. But let's pause for a moment, shall we? I'd love to know what you think. Have you ever imagined what it would be like to live in a time where every meal was an adventure and every drink was a gamble? If you were in this tavern, who would you be? Drunken storyteller? Quiet observer? Perhaps the one trying to survive the chaos? Like this video if you're ready to dive deeper into the world of medieval tavern life. Share it with friends who'd love to know what it was like to be a part of such wild, unpredictable times. And drop a comment below telling me what would be your role in the tavern. Let's see who's brave enough to take on the role of the drunken storyteller, or maybe the elusive bard hiding in the shadows. All right, enough of the chit-chat. Let's dive even deeper into the heart of the tavern, where the chaos is always growing, the drinks are always flowing, and the night is young. Grab your mug, find a seat if you can, and let's explore what really goes down in a medieval tavern because, trust me, the adventure is just beginning. And so, as the evening grew darker, the tavern stood like a flickering beacon of warmth in the midst of the chilly night. Its crooked, wooden frame leaned slightly to one side, as if burdened by years of unrelenting use. A heavy iron sign swung above the door, creaking with each gust of wind. The sign's once clear image had long since faded, leaving behind only a vague shape. Perhaps it had been a barrel or a bear. No one could say for certain anymore. But that didn't matter. It was the tavern. It was the place where all paths seemed to lead. The moment the door was pushed open, a flood of warmth greeted him. The kind of warmth that wraps around you and settles into your bones. The scent of smoke, wet wool, and something mysterious filled the air. It was thick, almost like a blanket, wrapping itself around him. There were sounds, too. The crackling of the hearth in the corner, the soft murmur of conversations blending together, and the occasional outburst of laughter. But beneath it all, there was a steady hum, the pulse of a place alive with stories, with lives, with the thrum of a world long past. Perhaps the smell of ale and smoke filled the air more than anything. There was a distinct, sour, sweet scent of unfiltered ale, spilling over every surface, lingering in the very wood of the walls and the straw on the floor. And beneath that, the ever-present undertone of sweat, animal musk, and mystery meat cooking somewhere in the back offered an earthy, raw comfort. The scent seemed to seep into everything. The worn benches, the tired wooden tables, even the thick, musty air itself. The tavern was alive with the sounds of a world that hadn't yet learned to whisper. It was loud, louder than the bustling street outside, louder than any quiet conversation should have been. The murmur of voices clashed with the laughter, the clinking of mugs, and the occasional shout from a heated debate at a distant table. The heat from the hearth, the smell of roasting meat, the warmth of ale. It was all there, enveloping him in an overwhelming embrace. He could hear the low, rhythmic thumping of boots on the dirt floor, the shuffle of movement as people found their places. The bench he sat upon was uneven and groaned beneath his weight. The sound of wood straining under pressure, reminding him that nothing here was ever quite settled. Every wooden plank seemed to creak in time with the soft sigh of the walls themselves, worn by years of laughter, shouting, and perhaps a few unspoken regrets. And so, as the evening wore on, the tavern's noise seemed to grow. The steady thrum of conversation, punctuated by laughter and the occasional shout, carried on through the night. Each voice seemed to speak at once, some telling stories, some arguing, some simply enjoying the drink and the company around them. The people here, for all their noise, felt somehow connected in their chaos, bound together by the warmth of the hearth and the shared comfort of the drink. You might have heard the creak of wooden benches as people shifted, trying to find a more comfortable position, or perhaps trying to find a seat at all. For the tavern was always full. The benches were not made for comfort, but for practicality. They were sturdy, but they creaked under the weight of time. They had borne countless hours of laughter, endless mugs of ale, and perhaps even a few fights. Every scratch on the wood, every worn edge told a story of a long and storied existence. As he settled into the bench, the warmth from the hearth bathed his face, though it could not quite reach the chill in his bones. The fire crackled and spat, sending sparks dancing upward in the dim light. The hearth, though a source of comfort, was also a reminder of the ever-present risk of fire. The flickering shadows on the walls seemed to dance to a rhythm only they could hear, and the heat of the fire did little to chase away the chill that crept in through the cracks in the wooden walls. Perhaps the dampness of the night had seeped into the very walls of the tavern, or perhaps it was just the weight of the long hours of the day, but the air inside the tavern was thick, heavy with the scent of bodies and spilled drink. It was the kind of place where even the air seemed worn. It felt like the tavern had been there for ages, its walls speaking of all the lives that had passed through, of those who had come for warmth, for company, for escape from the world outside. He looked around, taking in the sight of it all. The tavern was a strange mix of chaos and comfort. The low ceilings and uneven floor made it feel cramped, though it was certainly far from empty. A group of rough-looking men huddled near the hearth, their loud voices rising above the general din. In the far corner, a minstrel played a tune, though his fingers seemed unsure of the strings, creating a melody that was less music and more a backdrop for the conversations happening around him. The tavern keeper moved behind the makeshift bar, pouring drink after drink, shouting orders to those who dared to order food. His voice was gruff, but it carried the authority of someone who had long since stopped caring about niceties. The tavern keeper knew the rhythm of this place, understood the flow of noise and drink and laughter. It was a well-oiled machine, even if it looked like a wreck. Every now and then, his sharp eyes would glance around, scanning the crowd for trouble. And then there was the drink. Warm, thick, unfiltered ale was passed from hand to hand, mugs raised in cheer or desperation. The ale, sour and strong, never quite cold, was an equalizer. No matter who you were, you drank from the same mug, sat in the same benches, and found yourself drawn into the same conversations, arguments, and laughter. The night would carry on, as it always did, until the tavern keeper decided it was time to shut down. But that wouldn't happen yet. The sound of laughter and chatter filled the air, like a hum that couldn't be silenced. Someone yelled across the room, challenging a friend to a drinking contest, and the crowd cheered. Another group gathered around a table, hands raised, betting on a game of dice. The dice rattled on the wooden table, landing with a satisfying clatter. The stakes were high, just as high as the voices in the room, but no one here seemed to care much for rules. The tavern was its own kingdom, its own world, and for tonight, it was his world too. The walls seemed to close in as the night wore on. The flickering light of the hearth cast long shadows that stretched across the floor and up the walls, distorting the shapes of the people who sat in their own little worlds. The fire crackled, sending a burst of heat through the room, but the cold outside still clung to the edges of his mind. The warmth inside was a kind of illusion, a comfort that wouldn't last. Perhaps the smell of roasting meat was now mingling with the scent of the ale, the two combining in a way that made his stomach grumble even louder. The food, such as it was, would never be what he expected. There would be no fine cuts of meat, no neatly served dishes. Instead, it was pottage thick, stew-like, made from whatever scraps had been available that day. The meat, likely rabbit or pigeon, had been simmering for hours, absorbing the flavors of whatever had been thrown into the pot. The tavern was not a place of refinement. It was a place for survival, for finding comfort in the chaos of the world. There were no menus, no polite waitstaff. You asked for food, and you hoped it was warm, or at least not too spoiled. But no one complained. There was a certain beauty in the simplicity of it all. The tavern was a place where you didn't have to be anything more than yourself. Here, you could just exist. As he took a deep breath, the noise of the tavern faded slightly, and he let the warmth of the hearth and the laughter around him wash over him like a soft, rhythmic lullaby. There was something comforting about the chaos. It was predictable in its unpredictability. The people around him might be strangers, but they were all bound by the same shared experience. The warmth of the fire, the taste of ale, the hunger for something more. And tonight, that was enough. As the evening stretched deeper into the night, the tavern seemed to grow more alive, though not in the way one might expect. There was no sudden change in volume or chaos. Rather, it was a soft shift, a mellowing of the energy in the room, as if the very walls themselves had grown accustomed to the rhythm of the night. The fire crackled steadily, its flames dancing and casting a warm golden light across the room. But the warmth, though comforting, was not enough to chase the chill that lingered outside, pressing against the tavern's thick, crooked walls. The noise around him, once lively and unrestrained, had softened, becoming more like a murmured hum in the background. Voices blended together in a steady murmur, their edges blunted by the warmth and the fatigue that came with the passage of time. You could still hear the clink of mugs, the occasional outburst of laughter, but it was no longer frantic. It was the quiet joy of a long evening winding toward its end. A deep, collective sigh seemed to hang over the crowd, as if the entire room shared the same tiredness. Perhaps the smell of ale and smoke filled the air even more as the evening drew on. The thick, pungent scent of unfiltered ale had saturated the very wood of the tavern, clinging to the rough beams above and the straw that covered the floor. It mixed with the lingering scent of meat, a rich, savory aroma that wrapped around the room like an unspoken promise of sustenance. The fire, though crackling steadily, no longer held the lively heat it had at first. The room was just warm enough to be comfortable, but not enough to melt away the lingering dampness of the outside world. Around the room, the crowd had settled into a rhythm, a comfortable lull that seemed to take over the space. No longer did the conversations burn with the urgency of new arrivals. Instead, the voices were more subdued, the words spoken with a kind of ease that came with the evening's familiarity. A man in the corner, whose shoulders were hunched from weariness, leaned forward and set his mug down on the table with a soft thud. The sound was small, but it seemed to ripple through the room. People turned their heads, catching the brief glance of a stranger among them. But the moment passed quickly, as moments in the tavern often did. The tavern keeper, who had been a constant moving presence throughout the night, made his rounds with an almost mechanical precision. His heavy boots were quiet against the dirt floor, but his eyes were always alert, always watching. He had seen this scene 1,000 times before, the strangers who wandered in, the fights that erupted and settled, the tales spun and retold. But tonight, his eyes lingered a moment longer on the fire, as though it held some secret, something he was waiting for. Perhaps it was simply the end of another long night. He moved with purpose, refilling mugs without a word, his large, calloused hands pouring the ale with a practiced ease. The firelight caught the edge of his face, highlighting the rough lines and the weariness that seemed to match the tavern itself. There was something steady about him, something unmovable, as though he had lived for decades in this same space, caught between the noise of the night and the stillness of the morning. You might have heard the creak of wooden benches as people shifted their weight, finding new, more comfortable positions. The benches had been worn smooth by years of use, their legs groaning under the strain of so many bodies. It was not a place of comfort in the traditional sense. There were no plush cushions, no velvet pillows to lean back against. The tavern offered only the hard, simple solace of a seat and the warmth of the fire. Yet in this roughness, there was a certain comfort and understanding that the night would end as it always had, with the flicker of firelight and the quiet hum of weary bodies. At one table, an older man sat with a tankard of ale, his hand shaking slightly as he raised it to his lips. His fingers were gnarled, like twisted branches of an ancient tree, worn by years of labor, of living, of surviving. Beside him sat a younger man, perhaps a son or a nephew, someone who had not yet known the years of struggle. His face was still fresh, unmarked by time. He watched his elder with quiet reverence, his eyes flickering to the fire every now and then back to his companion. They didn't speak much, but there was a bond between them, a shared history written in the silence that passed between them. The older man's eyes, though dimmed by age, still held a sharpness, a knowing that could not be faked. It was in the way he set the mug down slowly, with care, as if measuring each movement. The younger man listened with his eyes, his ears attuned to the soft grumbling of his elder's voice when he spoke, and the quiet, almost imperceptible sighs that came from his lips as he leaned back in his seat. It was the kind of silence that spoke of long days spent together, of shared burdens and unspoken understandings. The minstrel, still perched in the corner, seemed unaware of the shift in the room. His lute had not yet found its rhythm, but he continued to strum, his hands moving across the strings with a kind of mechanical repetition. Perhaps the music had become secondary, just something to fill the space, to create the illusion of something more than the quiet that had settled over the room. The tune was simple, repetitive, a gentle backdrop to the fading voices. Every now and then, the minstrel would lift his head, scanning the room with tired eyes, as if searching for something. But he never spoke. He never moved beyond his corner, as if he was rooted in place by some invisible force. The conversation at the table nearest to the fire was a little more lively. The young man, still fresh-faced, laughed loudly at a joke that was clearly not his own. His laughter, though genuine, seemed a little too eager, too sharp. Perhaps it was the ale that had loosened his tongue, or perhaps it was the company that made him feel more at ease. His companions, a few farmers and a tradesman, shared the joke with him, though they all knew it was just a passing thing, a fleeting moment of humor in a world that did not often have the time for laughter. They had heard it before. Perhaps the smell of meat in the air was stronger now, carried by the warmth from the hearth. It was a smell that spoke of simple things: meat slowly roasted, bread baking, the tang of salt and spices in the air. There were no great feasts here. The food was a far cry from the banquets of kings or the elaborate dishes of nobility. Here, the food was simple. The pottage, thick and earthy, simmered on a fire in the back corner, its contents unknown but understood to be filling. A bowl of pottage, perhaps, was placed before the younger traveler who had just entered. His hands, still damp from the rain, shook slightly as he reached for his spoon. He looked down at the thick stew, unsure of what it might be, but grateful for it nonetheless. The steam rose from the bowl, mixing with the smoke in the air, a vapor that seemed to linger, drawing the tiredness from his body with its warmth. For a moment, there was a strange quiet, as though the entire tavern had paused in unison. The sound of spoons scraping against wooden bowls, the shuffle of boots on the dirt floor, all faded into a gentle hum. The fire crackled softly, its heat a comfort and a warning. It was the kind of night that could stretch on forever, caught between the moments of silence and the bursts of noise. It was the kind of place where time seemed to stand still, held captive by the rhythm of the hearth and the shared weariness of those who had come to rest. Outside, the rain continued to fall, though it was no longer the furious downpour it had once been. The storm had passed, leaving behind only the lingering dampness in the air. The smell of wet earth still drifted in through the cracks in the tavern's walls, mingling with the smells of ale and meat. The door creaked open, letting in a brief gust of air, but the warmth inside held firm, like a shield against the world outside. And as the night wore on, the noise in the tavern softened once more. The conversations became fewer, the voices lower. One by one, the patrons began to lean back in their chairs, their eyelids heavy, the exhaustion of the day beginning to take its toll. Some still clung to their drinks, unwilling to let go of the warmth and the comfort they offered. But others simply set their mugs down, resting their heads against the back of their benches. The tavern keeper watched over them all, his eyes scanning the room with the quiet authority of someone who had seen it all before. He knew the rhythms of the night, the ebb and flow of the crowd. He could tell when the laughter would rise and when the silence would fall. And tonight, the silence had come, not in a rush, but in a slow, steady wave that had gently swept through the tavern. As the last few voices died down, the tavern seemed to exhale. The fire crackled once more, its flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the night was still dark, the kind of darkness that seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. Inside, the tavern stood still, its walls holding the warmth of the evening, the scent of ale and smoke, and the stories of those who had come to rest there, if only for a few fleeting hours. The fire in the hearth continued its steady dance, sending flickers of gold and red light into the far corners of the room. Its warmth was now familiar, a constant companion in the cool, damp air that surrounded the tavern. As the minutes dragged into hours, the room seemed to settle deeper into the quiet embrace of the night. There were no clocks here, no ticking hands to measure the passing of time. Here, in the low, flickering light of the hearth, time stretched out like the embers, slowly fading as the minutes turned to hours. The tavern keeper moved with ease through the room, his movements slow and deliberate. He was an old man, his face etched with the passage of years, his body heavy with the weight of those years spent tending this very tavern. His gait was steady, sure, though his shoulders bore the stoop of a man who had long ago stopped carrying the weight of the world on his back. His boots creaked softly on the wood floor, a sound almost as familiar as the crackling of the fire. The tavern was his domain, and he knew it as well as he knew his own skin. He moved like a shadow in the dim light, always present, always watching, always listening. The light from the hearth cast long shadows that seemed to stretch and sway like living things. The walls, made of crooked timber and stone, absorbed the firelight, reflecting the quiet intensity of the room. There was a kind of soft warmth to the air now, no longer the heat of the flames, but the accumulated warmth of bodies, of the fire, of the years spent in this place. The thick smell of ale hung heavy in the air, mixing with the faint scent of wet wool and the sharp, earthy undertone of meat roasting slowly somewhere in the back. Perhaps it was the smell of bread baking in the kitchen that drifted through the room, the aroma rich and yeasty, mingling with the other scents to create something almost comforting. It was a humble smell, far from the fancy feasts of kings or the perfumed kitchens of nobles. But here, in the quiet sanctuary of the tavern, it was enough. The food wasn't meant to impress or to delight. It was meant to fill the belly, to provide warmth and sustenance to those who had come in from the cold. The man near the fire shifted in his seat, the heavy wood of the bench creaking beneath his weight. His eyes, though half closed with exhaustion, still lingered on the flames. His face was shadowed by the flickering light, the lines of his skin softened by the glow. There was something almost reverent in the way he watched the fire, as though it held answers to questions he had long since stopped asking. Perhaps he had seen this same fire burning countless times, watched the flames flicker, die, and then rise again. He had been coming to this tavern for years, a constant presence, his name known by all but spoken by none. His eyes, weary but sharp, had seen the comings and goings of many, but he remained unchanged, like a stone in the river, watching as the world passed by. At the far side of the room, a young man sat with his back against the wall, his head tilted back slightly as if he was trying to catch his breath. His hair was wet from the rain, and his cloak, though thick, was soaked through. He looked out of place here, too new, too clean. The tavern was filled with the familiar sense of mud, smoke, and worn leather. But this young man smelled of fresh rain and something else, something far more distant from the rough, lived-in scent of the tavern. He had sat in silence for a while now, watching the room with quiet curiosity, his eyes moving over the faces of the patrons. Some were lost in conversation, others in their own thoughts, and some simply watched the fire as it slowly consumed the logs, sending out a thin wisp of smoke that rose and disappeared into the rafters above. He was an outsider here, a stranger in this place of familiarity, but there was something in the way he held himself, in the way his eyes scanned the room, that made him seem less out of place than one might have thought. A soft voice, light and melodic, rose above the low murmur of the crowd. It was a woman singing, her voice lilting and full of warmth. The song was familiar, an old tune that had been passed down from mother to daughter, from grandmother to granddaughter. It was the kind of song you might hear at the hearth of a home, the kind that comforted more than it entertained. The words were soft and slow, the melody gentle, like a lullaby that had grown up with the people in the tavern. The woman did not sing loudly. She didn't need to. Her voice was enough to carry through the room, filling the empty spaces with a warmth that matched the fire in the hearth. The song made its way through the room like the smoke that swirled above the fire. It was not a song for celebration or merriment, but one for quiet moments, for those who were too tired to speak and too content to move. The man near the fire, his hands still resting loosely on the edge of his mug, let out a small sigh, the tension in his body easing. He was not a man who was easily moved, but the sound of the woman's voice seemed to settle something deep inside him. Perhaps it was the weariness of the day, or perhaps it was the comfort of knowing that in this place the world could wait. And yet, even as the woman sang, the tavern continued to breathe in its own way. The low hum of conversation never quite stopped. There were those who spoke in hushed tones, sharing secrets and stories that would never see the light of day. There were the farmers, their hands rough from the day's work, who muttered quietly about the price of grain, the weather, and the latest gossip from the town. And there were those who simply listened, who observed the ebb and flow of the night, content to take part in the experience without truly participating. It was this subtle dance between the stillness and the noise that gave the tavern its rhythm. It was not a place of grand events or high drama. It was a place where life simply happened, moment by moment, woven into the very walls of the building. The tavern had seen it all: the joys, the sorrows, the quiet victories, and the loud, drunken fights. It had witnessed the passing of time, the ebb and flow of seasons, and the comings and goings of countless souls. But for now, in this moment, it was still a living, breathing thing, pulsing gently with the heartbeat of the fire and the warmth of the room. The young man near the back of the room shifted again, glancing up at the minstrel who still strummed softly on his lute. The minstrel's fingers were slow and deliberate, his gaze distant, as though the music had become secondary to whatever thoughts were occupying his mind. His song had grown quiet, a gentle refrain that seemed to mimic the stillness of the room. It was a song that seemed to reflect the mood of the tavern itself, tired but content, worn but steady. You might have heard the soft shuffle of feet as one of the farmers rose from his seat, his joints creaking with the effort. He made his way toward the bar, his boots scraping against the floor, his gait heavy and slow. The tavern keeper, who had been watching the room with his usual quiet attentiveness, nodded to the farmer as he approached. Without a word, the farmer set down his mug and reached for a fresh tankard of ale. His face, weathered and tired, was lit by the glow of the fire, casting deep shadows beneath his eyes. The tavern keeper said nothing, but there was a moment of silent understanding between them. The farmer had come here many times before. This was a routine, a simple exchange: ale for coin, silence for comfort. The farmer nodded his thanks as the tankard was set before him, his hand briefly brushing the tavern keeper's as he took it. And then, without another word, he turned back toward his seat, the firelight reflecting off his worn leather cloak. The room seemed to shift again, though it was subtle. The noise had lessened, the air thickening with a kind of quiet expectation. The fire crackled softly, the embers in the hearth sending out occasional sparks. The soft song of the woman continued, but it was now accompanied by the occasional sigh, the occasional rustle of a cloak, as though the entire room had grown tired, each patron slowly sinking into their place, into the comfort of the night. Perhaps the young man, still seated near the back of the room, was the last to feel it, the quiet certainty that had settled over the tavern. It was not the kind of certainty that could be put into words. It was a feeling, a weight that seemed to press down on the air itself, reminding everyone that they were part of something greater, something that had been going on long before they had arrived, and would continue long after they had gone. And as the night wore on, the fire burned low, the shadows stretching ever longer. The tavern seemed to settle even further into its rhythm, the patrons now more like a part of the room itself. The fire's glow softened, and the warm, earthy scent of the room seemed to grow even deeper. The sounds of the tavern, the murmurs of conversation, the clinking of mugs, the steady hum of life blended together like a lullaby, coaxing the room into a slow, peaceful slumber. Time slowed, and the night grew deeper, quieter, as the tavern keeper stood at his post, watching over the room he had known so well. And there, in the silence that had settled between the flickering flames, the tavern continued to live. As the night continued its slow march, the fire in the hearth burned lower still, the flames now faint and fragile, casting only the softest of glows across the room. The air around the hearth grew a little cooler, but the warmth that lingered from the earlier blaze held fast, wrapping the tavern in a familiar, comforting embrace. It was the kind of warmth that seeped into your bones, easing the tiredness that had accumulated over the day. Outside, the wind had picked up again, whistling through the cracks in the tavern's weathered walls. Yet, inside, there was only the steady, rhythmic crackling of the fire, a lullaby to accompany the night's deepening quiet. You might have noticed the way the light shifted, how the room seemed to change with every flicker of flame. The wooden beams above, now less illuminated, cast long, eerie shadows, stretching and swaying as the fire danced beneath them. The walls, though thick and sturdy, seemed to breathe, the slight creaking of the timbers marking the passing of time, a constant reminder that the tavern itself was alive in its own way. It was a building that had seen countless nights just like this one, and perhaps, in some strange, unknowable way, it remembered them all. The patrons, now fewer in number, had begun to settle into the long night, their voices lower, their movements slower. There was something almost sacred in the stillness that had taken over the room, something that made the tavern feel less like a place of drinking and more like a sanctuary for weary souls. The young man who had come in earlier, still seated near the back, had closed his eyes for a moment, his face softened by the warmth of the fire, his cloak, once damp from the rain, now dried in the heat, the edges of it curling slightly in the fading light. He had come to the tavern seeking something rest, warmth, solace, but now he found himself wrapped in the quiet embrace of the night, as if the room itself had drawn him in and whispered him into its own rhythm. A man near the bar, his features heavy with fatigue, leaned back in his chair, letting out a slow, long breath. His eyes were half closed, his brow furrowed slightly in thought. His tankard, now half empty, rested on the table before him, its dark amber contents long since cooled. The night had taken its toll on him, as it had on all of them. The weight of the day, the journey, the hardships all seemed to be melting away in the warmth of the tavern, each breath drawn in sync with the slow pulse of the fire. It was a quiet surrender, an acknowledgement that the world outside could wait, that for now there was peace to be found in the flickering shadows and the soft murmur of voices. The minstrel, who had been lost in his quiet strumming for some time, paused for a moment. His fingers rested gently on the strings of his lute, and for the briefest of moments, the room was filled with nothing but the low hum of the fire and the distant sound of the wind outside. The minstrel's eyes were distant, his gaze fixed on something far beyond the tavern walls, as though he too had become lost in the ebb and flow of the night. His thoughts, like the night itself, seemed to stretch far and wide, meandering through the stillness, finding their way to a place of quiet reflection. Perhaps it was the weariness of the hour, or the weight of the song he had been playing, that made him pause. But for now, he let the lute rest in his lap, its strings vibrating gently in the silence. Outside, the rain had slowed to a light drizzle, the sound of it tapping softly against the windows, now barely audible over the whispers of the fire. The wind, though still present, had taken on a gentler tone, its howling reduced to a soft murmur. The tavern's heavy wooden door still cracked open slightly to allow for a bit of fresh air, creaked as the wind tugged at it. But inside, there was no hurry, no rush. The night stretched on, each passing minute feeling like an eternity, suspended in time, held gently by the soft glow of the fire and the warmth that hung in the air. You might have heard the faint shuffle of boots against the floor, as a few more patrons, those who had remained a little longer than most, stood to leave. Their movements were slow, almost reluctant, as though they were loath to leave the comfort of the tavern behind. Their cloaks were drawn tight around their shoulders, their boots heavy with the weight of the mud and rain they carried with them. But there was a calmness in the way they moved, as though they had been lulled by the stillness of the room, the quiet hum of life that had taken over the tavern. The door opened once more, letting in a small gust of air, but the warmth within the tavern remained unbroken. The figures disappeared into the night, their footsteps fading as the door slowly closed behind them with a soft thud. The tavern, now emptier, seemed to settle further into its own rhythm. The fire, though still alive, burned lower, its crackles becoming less frequent. The shadows in the room deepened, and the faces of those who remained were softened by the low light, their features cast in a gentle glow. The silence seemed to stretch on, growing heavier with each passing moment. The walls of the tavern seemed to lean in closer, the wood creaking softly as if it, too, was settling into the night. You might have noticed the faint scent of damp earth, carried in from the outside by the light drizzle that had begun to tap against the windows. It was a scent that brought with it the promise of the dawn, a reminder that the night, though long, would eventually give way to morning. The quiet drip of water from the eaves outside could just be heard, mixing with the sound of the fire as it slowly died. Yet, for now, the tavern was alive in its own way, a world unto itself, caught in the stillness of the moment. The older man near the hearth, who had not spoken a word in hours, looked up, his eyes briefly meeting those of the tavern keeper. There was a moment of quiet understanding between them, a shared recognition of the passage of time. The man didn't need to say anything. His eyes, clouded with age but sharp nonetheless, spoke volumes. Perhaps he had seen this all before the quiet hours when the tavern seemed to hold its breath, when the last few patrons lingered in the shadows, waiting for the night to end. But the night had no need to hurry. It would end when it was ready, when the fire finally died and the first light of dawn crept in through the cracks in the walls. The tavern keeper, whose face was etched with years of quiet service, nodded slightly in acknowledgement. His hands, though worn and weathered, still moved with precision as he adjusted the logs in the hearth, letting out a soft crackle as the fire shifted slightly. It was a simple act, but in that moment, it seemed to mark the closing of the day, the slow end to another night in the long history of the tavern. The young man, still seated near the back, opened his eyes at last, blinking slowly as he adjusted to the dimmer light of the room. The others had long since settled into their own quiet corners, and the silence now seemed to envelop him in a way it hadn't before. The weight of the night pressed gently against his shoulders, urging him to rest, to relax, to give in to the peaceful rhythm of the tavern. He sat there for a moment longer, listening to the soft crackling of the fire, before he stood slowly, stretching his legs, which had stiffened from sitting for so long. His steps were slow, measured, as he moved toward the bar, the worn floorboards creaking under his boots. He did not hurry, for there was no need. The tavern keeper, still tending to the fire, gave him a quiet nod as he approached. The young man paused for a moment, taking in the stillness of the room once more, before placing a coin on the counter. The tavern keeper took the coin, his hands steady, but his eyes never leaving the fire. There was no need for words between them. They understood one another well enough. The young man took his leave with a soft nod and a lingering glance at the flames before making his way toward the door. The door creaked open, and for a moment, the noise of the rain outside flooded in, a stark contrast to the warmth and quiet within. But as quickly as it had entered, the door closed behind him, the sound of the storm once more cut off by the thick walls of the tavern. Inside, only the fire remained, flickering softly in the corner. The quiet stillness of the night seemed to deepen, wrapping the tavern in a calm that would last until the first light of dawn. The tavern keeper, now the only one left in the room, stood still for a moment longer. The fire crackled softly, its warmth a constant reminder of the life within the tavern. With a slow, practiced motion, He gathered a few remaining logs and placed them on the fire, sending one last flare of light into the darkened corners of the room. Then, as the flames settled once more into a steady glow, he turned toward the back, his movements slow, his eyes tired but content. The night had passed, and with it the stories, the laughter, and the quiet moments shared between strangers had all found their place in the history of the tavern. The last embers of the fire glowed softly, the room settling into a peaceful silence, and with that, the tavern was at rest, waiting for the dawn. The hours moved with a kind of languid grace, as though the world itself had decided to rest for a while, allowing the tavern to settle into the stillness of the night. Outside, the soft drizzle had given way to a deeper silence, the sound of raindrops now only a faint murmur against the earth. The wind had stilled, too, its earlier howls, subsiding into the kind of quiet that spoke of nothing but the passage of time. Inside the tavern, the fire's glow had dimmed further, its once bright flames reduced to a bed of soft embers that pulsed gently in the hearth. The air, though still warm from the fire, had begun to take on the coolness of the night. It was a gentle chill, the kind that could only be felt by those who had stayed too long in the warmth, letting the coolness creep in slowly, softly. There was no need for a rush now. The tavern had become a sanctuary from the world, a place where time did not press, where the minutes stretched endlessly like the shadows that flickered against the walls. The deep silence, though heavy, was not uncomfortable. It was a kind of peace, one that had settled over the room like a soft, velvet blanket. The last of the patrons had long since taken their leave, slipping out into the night one by one. The door had creaked softly each time it opened, admitting a breath of cool air before gently closing behind them, leaving only the soft murmur of the fire to fill the room. The tavern keeper, now alone in the quiet space, moved with the slow, deliberate steps of a man used to the silence. His figure was a dark silhouette against the low, flickering light, his movements smooth, practiced, as he went about his quiet duties. His boots made no sound on the dirt floor as he made his way toward the back of the room, where the dim light of the hearth barely reached. The fire's warmth clung to him, though he had long since ceased to notice it. It was simply there, a constant companion, just as the tavern had been, a presence that never faltered. He paused for a moment, his gaze sweeping over the empty room. The benches, still warm from the bodies of the patrons, were now quiet and still, as though they had absorbed the energy of the night and were resting themselves. The tables, cluttered with half-drunk mugs and forgotten plates, seemed to breathe with the quiet rhythms of the tavern. The quiet was profound here, but it was not oppressive. It was a space between moments, a place where the world outside could not reach, a realm where time itself was suspended. The fire, though now only a quiet glow, still whispered in the hearth, the occasional flicker of light casting long, gentle shadows across the walls. The low hum of the air, thick with the scent of old wood, damp earth, and the lingering trace of ale filled the space, comforting in its familiarity. The tavern keeper moved closer to the fire, kneeling down to adjust the embers one last time, ensuring that the heat would continue for a little while longer. There was something meditative in this simple act, something that connected him to the many nights before and to the many nights yet to come. He took his time, working slowly, almost reverently, as though the fire itself was a living thing, one that needed to be tended with care. Perhaps it was in these moments, when the tavern was still, when only the fire and the silence were his companions, that he felt the true weight of the place. This tavern, with its crooked walls and low ceilings, had been home to countless stories, some grand, some small, but all equally important in their own way. It had witnessed the comings and goings of kings, travelers, farmers, and wanderers, and through it all, it had remained steady and unwavering, a constant in the ever-changing tides of the world. As he sat back on his heels, gazing into the dimming fire, the tavern keeper allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. His thoughts, though rarely given voice, drifted back to the faces he had seen over the years, the young, the old, the broken, the whole. The tavern had been many things to them, a place of refuge, of solace, of merriment, or of sorrow. But to him, it was always home, a place where time slowed, and where the rhythms of the world outside could not reach. Here, there were no deadlines, no demands, no responsibilities, only the steady pulse of life captured in the quiet flicker of the flames. And so, as the fire's light softened further, a deeper stillness descended over the room. The shadows in the corners of the tavern lengthened, stretching with the slow, deliberate pace of the night. Outside, the first hints of dawn were beginning to creep in, though the tavern keeper, lost in his thoughts, did not notice. The walls of the tavern, thick with history and memory, seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the world to turn once more. The air in the room grew cooler still, the warmth of the fire now more of a memory than a presence. Yet even in the absence of the fire's glow, the tavern felt full of memories, full of stories, full of life. The benches, now empty, seemed to hold the weight of all those who had sat there, shared a drink, shared a laugh, shared a silence. And the tavern keeper, though alone now, did not feel lonely, for in this quiet, he knew that the tavern was alive, and that its heart beat softly, steady as ever. As the first faint light of morning began to filter through the small, narrow windows, casting a pale glow across the room, the tavern keeper stood slowly. His back was stiff, his joints aching slightly from the long hours of watching over the tavern, but he moved with a certain grace that had been honed by years of practice. He made his way toward the back of the room once more, his hands reaching out to close the heavy shutters that covered the windows, blocking the early light from creeping in too soon. The tavern, now fully shrouded in darkness once again, seemed to sigh in contentment, its walls embracing the quiet. The fire, though low, still whispered in the hearth, its warmth a final, lingering touch in the still air. The tavern keeper, his duties now complete, stood for a moment longer, looking out over the room one last time before he retired to his own quarters, tucked away behind the thick wooden door at the far end of the tavern. The silence was absolute now, broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire. The night had come to an end, and the tavern, like the world outside, would rest for a time. But soon enough, the morning would come, and with it, new faces, new stories, new lives to pass through its doors. For now, though, the tavern slept, wrapped in the quiet, its heart beating softly, steadily, in time with the pulse of the world outside. And the tavern keeper, at rest for the moment, knew that tomorrow, as always, the rhythm would begin again. The night had passed, and in its silence, the tavern awaited the dawn. As the last of the patrons stumbled out into the pale, cool light of dawn, the tavern, for a brief moment, was still. The fire in the hearth, once a roaring and lively presence, now sat quietly, its embers glowing softly like tired stars before they faded into darkness. The once boisterous room, filled with the clatter of tankards, the laughter of drunk men, and the lively chatter of tavern folk, was now a silent witness to the passage of time. The walls, covered in soot and age, seemed to sigh with relief, as though the very structure of the building had been waiting for this moment of quiet. For now, the chaos had been swept away, leaving only the lingering scent of spilled ale, damp wool, and the faint, almost imperceptible traces of 100 stories told over the course of the night. The tavern keeper, a quiet, ever-present figure in the heart of the room, moved slowly through the space. His boots, worn smooth from years of standing behind the bar and walking across the wooden floors, made no sound as he traversed the room. There was no rush in his movements. The day had not yet begun in earnest, and the tavern was still in the process of exhaling the events of the night. There was something peaceful, almost sacred, in this brief moment between the end of one day and the beginning of another. A time when the tavern, like a body after a long day's work, could finally rest and breathe in the cool, empty air. With his long, calloused hands, he took up the broom, sweeping up the straw that had collected along the floor, dirt mixed with the remnants of spilled drinks and the occasional scraps of food. The broom moved in slow, deliberate arcs, a simple task, but one that, in its very simplicity, gave him time to reflect. The tavern keeper knew these floors well, knew each creak of the wood, each crack in the floorboards. He had seen it all, the comings and goings of countless faces, the laughter that filled the room, the tears that went unnoticed, and the fights that had left their scars on the tavern's walls. He had witnessed it all, and yet he never once tired of it. There was something about the rhythm of it that soothed him, the rhythm of life that played out in this humble space. As he moved past the tables, now scattered and empty, his eyes lingered on the benches, the ones near the hearth, the ones where the regulars sat, year after year. The farmer who always took the same spot by the fire, his rough hands wrapped around a mug of ale. The merchant from the south who always talked of deals struck and goods sold, his fine clothes a stark contrast to the dusty, worn floor beneath him. And, of course, the bards, those ragged figures who would stumble in after traveling for days, their instruments in tow, their voices hoarse but full of life. Each had their place, each had their rhythm. And yet, as the tavern keeper swept the straw from the floor, he realized that, in their absence, the tavern had lost something important, something intangible, but there was no time to dwell on the absence. There was always more to be done. The tavern was a living thing, and like all living things, it required care. A few logs were added to the hearth, the fire crackling slightly as the warmth returned to the room. The wooden stools and benches, some of which had been carelessly pushed aside in the frenzy of the night, were returned to their rightful places. The tavern keeper's movements were instinctive now, honed through years of repetition. He had worked these floors for as long as anyone could remember, his presence as much a part of the tavern as the crooked beams overhead. As the warmth returned to the room, he found himself reflecting on the moments that had unfolded just hours before. The tavern had, as always, played host to a variety of souls, some seeking a drink, some seeking companionship, others perhaps running from something they couldn't quite name. It had been a long night, full of noise and life, but now, in the quiet aftermath, the tavern keeper could see the beauty in the simplicity of it all. The faces had blurred into one, but the energy they had shared, the stories they had woven into the air, were still present, lingering like the smoke from the fire. He paused for a moment by the bar, his hand resting on the counter as he looked over the room. The shelves behind the bar were now nearly empty, save for a few stray bottles of wine and ale. The mugs, once filled to the brim and clinking against each other in boisterous cheers, were now clean and stacked neatly in a corner. The tavern keeper's gaze lingered on the mugs, each one a vessel for stories told. How many tales had been shared over these mugs? How many secrets whispered between sips of ale? The thought made him smile, a small, quiet smile that never quite reached his eyes. He had been witness to so many things, some trivial, others monumental, but all of them had left their mark on this place. The morning light grew stronger as he moved to the back of the room, the rhythmic creak of his boots, the only sound breaking the silence. The room felt almost reverent in the early morning light, the shadows lengthening as the tavern settled into its natural state. Outside, the sounds of the waking world began to bleed into the stillness: horse hooves on the cobbled streets, the low murmur of voices calling out from the market square, the soft trill of birdsong as the day slowly unfurled. But inside, the tavern was still. its energy tucked away for the moment, waiting for the next round of patrons to arrive. It was in these quiet moments that the tavern keeper felt most connected to the place. It wasn't the noise, the bustle, or the laughter that gave the tavern its life. It was the space between the quiet moments that came when everything else had settled. It was in the way the light filtered through the windows, soft and golden, that he could truly see the tavern for what it was, a vessel for human connection. It wasn't always beautiful, and it wasn't always tidy, but it was real. It was a reflection of life itself, imperfect, unpredictable, and full of stories that needed to be told. His hands worked with a quiet familiarity, arranging the stools, wiping down the counters, and ensuring that everything was in its place. But even as he worked, his mind wandered back to the faces of the night, faces that had come and gone, leaving their marks on the tavern's worn surfaces. The merchant, with his talk of far-off lands, the soldier, who had been too drunk to notice when his mug was knocked over, the group of locals who had argued so loudly over the price of bread, their voices a cacophony that drowned out everything else. And then there was the quiet farmer, who sat in the corner by the fire, always silent but always there, a constant presence in the ebb and flow of the tavern's life. The tavern keeper paused, leaning against the bar as he surveyed the room. He didn't need to speak to the patrons to know their stories. He had heard enough of them over the years, had seen enough of them reflected in the quiet moments, in the unspoken interactions, in the way people came together when the world outside became too much. The tavern had a way of drawing people in, of making them feel like they belonged, even if only for a night. He let out a soft breath, his eyes catching the flicker of the dying fire in the hearth. In the stillness of the early morning, the tavern had become something more than just a place to drink and eat. It had become a sanctuary, a refuge for all the people who had nowhere else to go. A place where their stories could live, if only for a while. As he began to gather the last of the straw from the floor, the tavern keeper couldn't help but think about the day ahead. Soon, the tavern would be filled again with life, and the rhythm of it all would begin once more. But for now, the tavern was at rest. It had earned this brief moment of peace. As the pale light of morning crept over the horizon, the tavern, now quiet, stood as it always had, its wooden walls weathered, its roof sagging ever so slightly under the weight of centuries. The first rays of dawn filtered through the cracks in the shutters, casting a gentle glow over the darkened room. The fire in the hearth, which had been the heart of the tavern through the long hours of the night, now flickered weakly, its embers slowly fading into ash. Outside, the world stirred, the stillness of the early morning broken by the soft chirp of birds, the rustle of leaves in the wind. But inside the tavern, all was still, as though the building itself had taken a deep breath, waiting for the bustle of the new day to begin. The transformation that had taken place within those walls over the course of the night was nothing short of remarkable. Where once there had been laughter, raucous shouting, and the constant clinking of mugs, now there was only silence. The tables, once crowded with the patrons of the night, were now empty, their surfaces marked with the remnants of spilled drinks and half-eaten meals. The benches, too, had emptied, their warm spots now cooling in the morning air. The smell of stale ale and wet wool still clung to the room, but even that was beginning to fade, replaced by the faint scent of dust and wood, as though the tavern had settled into a moment of rest. The medieval tavern, in all its rowdy, sticky, and unkempt glory, had been a place of transformation. It was more than just a building. It was a living, breathing entity, one that had seen the comings and goings of countless individuals from all walks of life. It was the heart of the community, a place where people gathered not just to drink and eat, but to share in the human experience, for better or for worse. Here, alliances had been forged, friendships had been tested, and rivalries had been born. Here, news had spread like wildfire, and rumors had taken root in the shadows. It was a place where laughter and tears, joy and sorrow, had mingled together in a way that was both chaotic and beautiful. The tavern was never just about the food or the drink. Yes, there was ale, thick and sour, and mead, sweet but strong. There was pottage, thick and hearty, and bread that was as heavy as the weight of the day's toil. But the food and drink were merely the backdrop to something far more important: the stories. The tavern was a place where stories were born, lived, and passed on. The stories were the lifeblood of the tavern, woven into the very fabric of the place. They were whispered in dark corners, shouted from the bar, or sung in the quiet moments between songs. And though some of these stories may have been embellished or distorted by time and drink, they were stories nonetheless. They were the moments that people would carry with them for the rest of their lives, the memories that would shape their lives in ways both subtle and profound. You might have heard them yourself. The stories of knights and merchants, of thieves and bards, of farmers and traders. Each person who entered the tavern brought with them a piece of their own world, their own life, and shared it with others. Some stories were small, simple anecdotes that would fade as quickly as they had been told. Others were grand, epic tales of heroism, love, and betrayal. These stories were passed from mouth to mouth, growing with each telling, becoming legends in their own right. And yet, despite the noise and the chaos, there was something deeply human about the way those stories were shared. In the tavern, people connected not through the formalities of life, but through their shared experience of living. And perhaps that is what made the medieval tavern so special. It was a place where everyone, no matter their rank or station, could come together, if only for a moment, as equals. It didn't matter if you were a knight returning from battle, a peasant with mud on your boots, or a merchant with coins jingling in your pouch. Inside the tavern's low wooden walls, you were all just people. The tavern was one of the few places where status and wealth did not determine your worth. It was a place of chaos, yes, but also of equality. And in that chaos, there was a strange sense of belonging. The laughter, though sometimes coarse, was real. The clinking of mugs, though often loud and jarring, was genuine. The argument over the price of a pig, or the fight that broke out over a spilled drink, were all part of the same tapestry of human experience that unfolded every night within those walls. It wasn't pretty, and it wasn't always peaceful, but it was life raw, unfiltered, and honest. And for all its flaws, for all its messiness, the tavern was a place where people could be themselves, where they could let their guard down, if only for a short while. Of course, the morning light changed everything. The rowdy clamor faded into the past, leaving behind only the echoes of what had been. The fire, now only a faint glow, had seen it all, had watched the room fill with voices and laughter, only to watch it empty as the night dissolved into the morning. The tables and chairs, which had once been occupied by so many, now stood empty, awaiting the next round of visitors. But while the noise and energy of the night had receded, the stories remained. They would be carried in the memories of those who had been there, whispered to others, shared again and again, until they too became part of the tavern's history. The medieval tavern was never meant to be pristine. It was never about being clean or organized or even polite. It was a place that existed outside the boundaries of order, a place where the rules of society were put on hold for a little while. In the tavern, people were free to be messy, free to make mistakes, and free to share in the chaos of life without fear of judgment. It was a space where humanity could stretch and breathe and live without restraint. And it was in that messiness, that imperfection, that the true magic of the tavern lay. As the morning hours deepened and the tavern's quiet returned, the stories of the night began to settle into the walls, like the scent of the ale and the smoke. They would linger there, waiting to be remembered when the next batch of travelers arrived. The tavern, though empty now, was never truly still. It pulsed with the memories of what had come before, and it waited, patiently, for the next round of laughter, stories, and chaos to come. This was the legacy of the medieval tavern. It was the beating heart of the community, a place where the boundaries between rich and poor, knight and peasant, were temporarily erased. It was a place where stories were shared and connections were forged, where people could be themselves in all their raw, imperfect glory. And though the tavern would eventually close its doors each night, it would never be empty, for the stories would always remain echoing in the corners, waiting for the next soul to walk in and add their voice to the chorus. The medieval tavern was a microcosm of life itself, chaotic, messy, loud, and beautiful. It was a place where people came together, if only for a few hours, to share in the human experience. And in that experience, they found something that transcended time: connection, a sense of belonging, a story worth telling. And so, as we leave the tavern behind, as the last of the morning light stretches across the empty benches, we are reminded that, though the noise may fade and the fire may dim, the stories of the medieval tavern will never truly be gone. They will live on, in the hearts and minds of those who shared them, and in the memory of a place where humanity, in all its mess and glory, came together to drink, laugh, fight, and above all, live. If you've enjoyed this journey back in time and felt a sense of connection to the stories shared within the medieval tavern's walls, please consider showing your support by liking, sharing, and commenting below. I would love to hear your thoughts on the tavern's timeless charm, its raw beauty, and the connections it fostered. Let me know what stories you would have shared in this lively space, or if you have your own memories of a place where you found warmth, connection, and perhaps a story that lives on even today. Thank you for joining me on this journey. May your own stories, like those in the tavern, be filled with warmth, laughter, and connection. Until next time, goodbye, and may the fire always burn bright in your heart.